Charles Darwin's barrier-breaking theory of evolution, which he first revealed in his 1859 book on the origin of species, caused incredible change and disruption in not only the field of science, but also in the field of religion. Darwin was aware that his theory was very controversial and therefore spent a great deal of time contemplating whether he should even release it to the rest of the world. Before he published his groundbreaking theory, the more commonly held beliefs regarding the development of man, which in many instances were derived from religion and the Bible, contrasted greatly to the scientific facts that Darwin discovered, proving that evolution did actually take place and now are more commonly believed today. The primary beliefs on this subject before Darwin's book were generally divided between religious ones and early yet very vague theories of evolution that were too undefined for anyone to be able to make final conclusions about. An example of this pre-Darwin belief was created over 2,600 years ago by a man named Anaximander from ancient Greece. Anaximander was a visionary who believed that humans came from fish or other aquatic creatures who would give birth to humans after a certain period of time. This idea was never popularly accepted, but it was a prime example of some of the radical beliefs that were in place before Darwin announced his theory of evolution. A slightly more accurate example was presented by Empedocles, roughly a century later. Empedocles presented a strange idea that monsters roamed the earth, but only the ones who were best adapted to their environment survived. This idea was slightly accurate, but was nowhere near the final theory on the survival of the fittest that Darwin later presented. Religious ideas on this topic also emerged before Darwin's time, such as the one presented by Carolus Linnaeus in 1744. He was a scientist who came up with the theory that God initially only created a few different species that eventually bred with each other and subsequently led to the creation of many new and different species. Darwin's theory proved to be very controversial and disliked by many. However, it was respected by others and eventually grew to be the most popular theory on the subject matter. For example, Alfred Russel Wallace and many other respected biologists supported the idea, which helped the theory gain popularity and credibility. Darwin's theory thus separated people into two groups, creationists versus evolutionists. This division caused controversy regarding whether religious beliefs should be more important than science and research. Charles Darwin's revolutionary theory of descent with modification today is still the most commonly believed theory due to its barrier-breaking evidence that was based on the magnificent wildlife found in one of the most surreal and diverse places on Earth, the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. Charles Darwin began his voyage to the Galapagos Islands in 1831 on the HMS Beagle. Before leaving, Darwin wrote a letter to his colleague, fellow scientist J.S. Henslow, stating, "In a few days' time, the Beagle will set sail for the Galapagos Islands. I look forward with joy and interest to this." After returning to England, Darwin recalled this initial voyage to the Galapagos, by far the most important event in my life, and it determined my whole career. While in the Galapagos, Darwin visited the islands of Floriana, San Cristobal, Isabella, Pinta, Santiago, as well as others, where he noticed the incredible wildlife that seemed to Darwin to have different characteristics based on the specific characteristics of the different islands. Most significantly, Darwin observed the varying subspecies of the Galapagos tortoises and finches on the individual islands. Darwin determined that based on the divergent food supplies available on the different islands, the species on each island had to develop different physical features that would allow them to actually obtain this food and thereby survive. For example, the saddleback tortoises on the Pinta Island had a unique saddleback shell that, because it was smaller than the shells of the other tortoises, made it easier for them to lift their heads in order to be able to reach the abundant amount of cactus found on their island. This observation helped them create the theory of natural selection, that only those species that develop features that would enable them to live and function in their specific habitat could survive. After Darwin returned to England following his initial voyage to the Galapagos, he began to formulate his theories based on the observations he had made there. He also met with fellow scientists to discuss his theory. Eventually, Darwin wrote his most prominent work on the origin of species, published in 1859, in which he originally proposed his theory of descent with modification, commonly known as the theory of evolution, based on his groundbreaking findings he discovered in the Galapagos. His brilliant theory was, in short, that organisms can change over time through a common pre-existing ancestor. Darwin stated that writing the book cost me 13 months and 10 days of hard labor. It is no doubt the chief work of my life. This book was a breakthrough in the field of science, but more than that, it changed many people's beliefs about both science and religion because it challenged many then commonly held religious views on how mankind came into being. Scientists and scholars all around the world bought the book, and the theory shocked the world. Before Darwin, most theories regarding the origin of species were religious and based around the Bible. In contrast, his theory of descent with modification was one of the first theories that provided actual scientific evidence of this subject. This theory broke scientific barriers by providing a reasonable scientific theory on how life originated on Earth. The publication of this theory caused huge controversy around the world, sparking debates between evolutionists and creationists, who were a religious-based group who believed that the origin of life and all aspects of nature originated through divine revelation. The creationists marked Darwin as anti-Christian because they believed he put his scientific beliefs over his faith in God. The Christian church dismissed the theory, as instead they continued to believe in the theory of creation by divine revelation as mentioned in the Bible. Even several religious scientists who read Darwin's theory disagreed with it. In particular, Adam Sedgwick, a British scientist and devout Catholic priest, mocked Darwin's theory and stated after reading his work, "I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts of it I admired greatly, parts of it I laughed until my sides were almost sore. Other parts I read with absolute sorrow, because I think them utterly false and greatly mischievous." Darwin himself did believe in God and considered himself a Christian. However, his theory did gain widespread yet unexpected support from the atheist community, who did not believe in God and were looking for a non-religious based theory on how life came about. In fact, in a letter Darwin wrote to his fellow Christian scientific colleague, Segreti, in 1859, regarding his recently published theory of evolution, he stated, "I had no intention to write atheistically." The battle between creationists and evolutionists carried on well into the 20th century, with the creation of new anti-Darwinist religious organizations such as the Anti-Evolution League, founded by evangelical leaders and preachers T.T. Martin and William Bell Riley. They who did not want the theory of evolution being taught in America's public education system. Around the time the Anti-Evolution League was being formed, the Scopes trial of 1925 was occurring. The Scopes trial was an American court case that made it to the Supreme Court of Tennessee between substitute teacher John Thomas Scopes and the state of Tennessee. Tennessee argued that Scopes violated the state's Butler Act, which stated that no theory of evolution could be taught in state-funded schools, and doing so would be considered illegal. At the end of the trial, Scopes was found guilty of teaching Darwin's theory, and the Butler Act was upheld. As a result, Scopes was originally fined $100, which is equivalent to over $1,000 in today's economy. Although the verdict of the Scopes trial was in favor of the creationists, the trial, later named the Trial of the Century by the New York Times, brought new light and publicity to Darwin's theory, and also provided new evidence for evolution in the theory. After the trial, there were many attempts to repeal the Butler Act until it was finally repealed in 1968 by the U.S. Supreme Court on the grounds that it was deemed unconstitutional. The effects of Darwin's barrier-breaking research still resonate today. The biggest research station found in the Galapagos Islands is on Santa Cruz Island, where Darwin conducted a lot of research, and is dedicated in his name. The research station practices a great deal of conservation efforts for the animals that Darwin used in his research to ensure that these beautiful and unique animals that Darwin studied can also be studied by future generations of intelligent researchers like Darwin himself. Charles Darwin, one of the greatest examples of breaking barriers in the fields of science and religion history has ever known. Using the magnificent wildlife of the Galapagos Islands to conduct his theory of descent with modification, which transformed people's beliefs on how life originated using scientific evidence instead of the Bible, and to the present day is still the most commonly adhered to and prominent theory on the subject of the origin of life.